You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 277 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I want to talk about the situation going on with Russia, Crimea, and the Ukraine. This has a lot of importance because of the relationship between the United States and Russia is heavily affected by the positions that the U.S. is going to take here on what's going on in the Sea of Azov. So hopefully I'll be able to give you a pretty detailed accounting of what happened, the actual incident itself with the Russian and the Ukrainian ships. And then I'll be able to provide, quite a bit of background information and then some analysis on, why is this important, and how if the U.S. should react. So I hope you enjoy it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, and check out the Libertarian Institute where you can find all my work. Daily news roundup I post in the blog section, and then the show is also featured on the homepage. And that's at libertarianinstitute.org. And if you're into social media, but you're getting tired of the Facebook and Twitter stuff, check out Minds. And if you already have an account on that crypto-based social networking site, my channel there is Immersion News, at Immersion News. So check that if you have a Minds account or if you're looking for a social media alternative. And I should say I do post a lot over on that site, which is why I suggest all of you go check it out because there's a lot of stories I'm posting up there. I've done a couple blog posts over there. So I think there's some worthwhile content. All right, before I get right into the Ukraine thing, I just want to say at the start of the show, because I think it's the most important thing going on right now, is that there's a real movement in the Senate to revive SJ Res 54, which is going to invoke the War Powers Act to kill the U.S. involvement supporting Saudi Arabia's and their coalition's war in Yemen. I'll link to a show in the show notes page where I discuss and break all that down. I don't want to do that on today's show. I just, want to highlight that what's going on there is absolutely a genocide against the Yemeni people. It has been described as a food war that Saudi Arabia is waging there. The United States plays a lot of essential support in that war. That's really the U.S. role, is to provide essential support to the blockade, diplomatic cover, the weapons needed to carry out this war. Until recently, the mid-air refueling of Saudi planes, but logistical maintenance support and assistance in targeting, which even opens the U.S. up to war crime, punishments if the U.S. would ever stand in any of those international treaties that, say certain things are war crimes, like bombing flocks of sheep to make the, population starve to death. And so, we can end our role in this at the very least, if not actually stop Saudi's war there completely. And we do this by, I think, using the War Powers Act. May probably be the best solution, or just a political solution. Like if the Trump sees that the Congress has gone past this with I don't know if he could override it or veto one of these things or not. But I'm assuming he can't. So if he sees Congress has gone past this, he may just well withdraw his support from Saudi Arabia to save him kind of the political embarrassment. So get out there and get your congressmen, or I think senators in this case, this is a Senate bill, on board with this. There's, I think, 18 or 19 co-sponsors to this bill. It was actually should have gone through in March, but it was killed by the Senate then, so they're trying to revive it. So there's a few procedural things that are going to have to happen to get this thing to pass. But it does seem possible, I guess, especially in the wake of this Khashoggi murder. And check out Foreign Policy Focus 275, a link in the show notes page. I have Will Porter on that show to discuss that and somehow that ties in with, the growing political pressure in the United States to push Trump away from, his alliance with Saudi Arabia. And so if you have one of those Democrat senators get out there and say, what are you, going along with Donald Trump's war? And, point out that these are the same Muslim people that if Donald Trump was turning them away at the border, they would be absolutely appalled. And here he is blowing up their homes and killing them. starving them to death. Save the Children estimates that 85,000 Yemeni children have starved to death from that war. ACLED finds that 57,000 people have been killed, as casualties of that war, many of them by the U.S. bombs that are dropped by the Saudi-owned F-16s that constantly fly over Yemen. And, this is the way we do it. SJ-Res 54. So when you think about it, Google it up. As far as I know, they haven't had another vote on it yet. And there's not one scheduled. And of course, I think once it gets scheduled, it'll probably be a pretty quick turnaround. I don't think they want to set a couple weeks to, allow for mounting political pressure. So call your senators, tell them to pass this and, to go through whatever political hurdles they need to get this to go through. I'll just mention on the, looking for ends to the Yemen war. We have the UN, the current, I think, UN envoy to Yemen, the Yemen conflict is this guy, Margaret Griffith. He's tried to arrange some peace talks. They haven't worked. It seems that at least, poison pill in the peace talks is a good way to, I guess, describe this, is that Saudi Arabia refused to allow safe passage to a Houthi envoy to attend the peace talks. So if you're not going to let your interlocutors of the peace talk actually attend safely, then you're unlikely to have any peace. It does seem, they're saying that, asking basically that the city of Hadada, which is currently controlled by the Houthis, who are the rebel group, is under attack now from the Saudi-led coalition. And so the UN is basically saying, turn the city over to us, because the city has the critical port of Hadada, where most of the, food and fuel that are going to come into Yemen, and almost all the aid enters here. It's the only port that could, hold these big cargo ships. In the north of Yemen, which I think is home to like 80% of the Yemeni population. So this port being open is essential to a country that before a 3-year long now civil war was already a very poor country, but now is on the brink of famine. As I said, people starving to death, including 85,000 children. And, they're saying, turn this port over to us. And, we'll do the inspections to make sure weapons are getting in, but we're going to make sure that we're getting food and fuel and everything into this country. My guess is that the Saudis are going to resist this and may get blamed on the Houthis, and, they may have a role in killing this, but it seems to me that would be actually a pretty big win strategically for the Houthis. And at the UN, the UK had issued a draft Security Council resolution, I guess is called, which would call for an end of the blockade of Yemen within, I think, 2 weeks if it was passed. And it seems that the U.S. is kind of putting the kibosh on that. So it doesn't look like we're going to get any progress here in the UN, and so the Congress is the way to go on ending this war and just getting the word out there. I mean, it's so simple, it's so cut and dry how awful this thing is, and that in its sense makes it almost unbelievable. When you go talk to some guy on the street and you try to tell him about this, that, don't believe that's happening just because of how awful it is. But it's really that awful, and it's, really makes it that simple to, that you just explain it, and almost anybody is going to agree with you. So if we, talk to people about this, and we're talking to the people in power about this, maybe we could get into it. I definitely just spent more time on Yemen than I intended to, but it is a really important issue. It's just so brutal and so unnecessary and so preventable that it's just something that I think we could just talk about and really get people to see our side on that one. I do want to talk now about what's going on in the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov, the Strait of Kerch, the Ukraine-Russia situation. I've seen it described as all these things. And so just a way too quick bit of history. And if anybody, if you want the evidence that backs up the narrative I'm going to lay out, I'll link to an article in the show notes page called Accusing Russia, a History Lesson by Ted Snyder. And you could get all that information. I've gone through it on the show several times, so I don't want to do that again. But basically what you had in, the recent history of Ukraine is the Ukrainian government in a bad situation. They need a bailout. The West is offering a bailout. Russia is offering a bailout. The West does a coup d'etat in Ukraine, overthrows the government, who I think was thinking of taking the Russian bailout to install a government that would definitely take the Western bailout. The new government, which has deep ties with neo-Nazi factions, starts to really align Ukraine with the West in NATO in a move that's unpopular to large portions of people who live within the Ukrainian borders, because they are native Russians. And, this is especially true of the Crimean Peninsula, a landmass that hangs off of the, end of the country into the Black Sea. So civil war breaks out, in backlash to the coup d'etat and the new government. Part of that civil war results in the Crimean Peninsula breaking away from Ukraine and being annexed by Russia in a move that was very popular among the people of Crimea. So Crimea is now Russia. Why this is important today is that in that region of the world, you have the Black Sea, and then you have a sea kind of resting and creating a pretty large water boundary between Russia and the Ukraine. And the entrance to that sea rests between the Russia proper and the Crimean Peninsula. And so, the situation before the annexation of Crimea was that Ukraine held one, kind of arm of the gate and Russia the other. And now the whole gate there, the Strait of Kerch, I believe is how it's said, is now owned by Russia in Russian territorial waters. Because these are Russian territorial waters, I think that, Russia is still kind of by international law is supposed to let the Ukrainian flagged ship cross the Strait of Kerch into Ukraine, because there's Ukrainian ports on the Sea of Azov. You got the Black Sea, the Strait of Kerch, and then the Sea of Azov there. And so there's, a large Ukrainian coastline there and Ukrainian ships that exit and enter, for that reason. However, because it's Russian territorial waters, Russia, I think, has rules that are allowed by international law to conduct inspections of the ship and to have a pilot on that ship, I guess, to, control where it goes. Another issue that's important to note here is that the Strait of Kerch isn't that wide, I think less than 2 miles, and Russia has invested a lot of money in infrastructure in Ukraine. As I was saying at the start of this, Ukraine wasn't in great financial situations prior to this whole civil war coup d'etat business, and so Russia invested a lot of infrastructure, including a bridge over this strait here. And so the Russian argument would be is that they're protecting like the infrastructure, like the bridge, by having their pilot on the ship and all this kind of stuff. And I'm sure to some extent it's just nonsense, that Russia's just exerting some pressure and power over Ukraine because they're the bigger, badder regional actor. So the actual event that unfolds here is you have some Ukrainian ships failing to listen to commands from Russian ships to go through the typical inspection process. The Ukrainian ships refuse, and Russia I believe, runs one of their ships into a Ukrainian flagged tugboat and then ended up firing on, but not killing anyone, on a couple of other ships and then seizing those ships. And I think they're currently holding the crew and those ships, although they say that nobody is, seriously injured or anything like that. Russia then parked a barge under the bridge, connecting the strait, making it impossible for anyone, I guess, like a ship to just sail on through. And Ukraine has protested this pretty heavily in the international court. However, their ships weren't following, kind of the rules of the road or the rules of the water here in Russian territorial waters. So in reaction to this event, Ukraine has declared martial law and mobilized forces. Of course, Ukraine is still in the midst of a civil war with Russian bad separatists in the east of the country. I don't think there's actually any battle lines along the Crimean Peninsula, and it's all in the Dokhem region of the east of the country that kind of the battle lines are. And there's only a ceasefire, the Minsk II, holding these sides apart at this point. And I think in recent days there's been some increased activity, at least along the border, if not some outright fighting in eastern Ukraine. And so the mobilization of forces, I guess, Ukraine is saying that they're afraid of being invaded by Russia. That seems to be quite the overstretch. There's really no evidence that Russia is going to invade, and that all they did here is attempt to enforce, even if it's, somewhat restrictive, their, rules of the Russian territorial water there in the Sea of Azov. The Ukrainian parliament stopped short, however, of going with a full-out declaration of war against Russia, so that seems to be a good sign. Dan McAdams and Ron Paul had a pretty good show on this today, and I'll link to that in the show notes page. McAdams points out that the president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, his approval rating is about 8%. And so, when you're unpopular, start a war is kind of a good political strategy. So it could be a situation like that, especially when you're able to, start a war and not really have it be a war with somebody that people see as, kind of a big bad bully in the neighborhood. Of course, the NATO countries are quick to exploit this situation. You have like the Atlantic Council, which is, a think tank supported by NATO, suggesting that the United States enforce like freedom of navigation and we sail our ships through this, area and, into the Sea of Azov and potentially, put us in a situation where, Russia has shown that if you're a ship and you're not going to follow the rules, we're going to fire on you trying to cross here. And it would essentially, put America's kins in the line of fire. And the hope, I guess, from the Americans would be is that the Russians back down and show they're not really, going to enforce these rules if we could just sail right on through. Moon of Alabama has a good piece. I think one of the best write-ups so far on this incident here. I'll link to that in the show notes page, explaining that strategically this won't work, because the Sea of Azov is, I guess, what's known as a flat-bottomed sea, and it's not very deep. In a lot of places, it's only like 7 meters or so. And, most U.S. ships, even the frigates, the little ships, are far too heavy and sit far too deep to operate here. And so it doesn't seem like the kind of battle that the United States could fight, even if we tried to, logistically. And yet you have these, apes at the NATO think tank, the Atlantic Council, really advocating for this. You also have Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, complaining that this is a big deal and, Russian aggression. Trump himself seemed to downplay this, so a round of applause for Trump, for not making a bigger deal out of this. And hopefully he could kind of quash Nikki Haley and say she's speaking out of line again. And hopefully she is. Trump kind of just said he hoped this situation resolves well. Another important note here, just in the geopolitics of the whole thing, Donald Trump will soon be meeting with Vladimir Putin. I think there's a G20 summit coming up and they're supposed to be on the sidelines there. An outstanding issue for Ukraine is, keeping the Americans to their position that Russia needs to return the Crimean Peninsula to Ukraine before the United States would start to engage diplomatically and lift sanctions against Russia. And the U.S. has put a lot of sanctions on Russia specifically in response to the annexation of Crimea. And Donald Trump didn't really commit to that position at Helsinki with Vladimir Putin. And so maybe the, Ukrainian president is hoping to put some, pressure on Trump by making a big deal of this issue and trying to have Trump stake out a hawkish position against Vladimir Putin prior to this going on. And, he's going to receive a lot of political pressure too. The hawks in both parties will have their talons out, really looking to push Donald Trump into, saying that Crimea must be returned to Ukraine. Something that I just don't think is going to happen and is only could set up, potential conflict between the United States and Russia. All right. I think that lays out just about everything we know up until this point. Hopefully this doesn't get in the way of the, Trump-Putin talks. That's the big thing. And, my guess is that Russia will return the ships to Ukraine and the crew at some point in the very near future, if they haven't even by the release of this podcast. And it's going to be hard, I think, to make a bigger deal out of this, especially when, so much attention is being paid to Syria and other places right now. A couple other stories I just wanted to mention that I think are important. Rand Paul put a hold on the bill that's being, I guess, going through to give Israel their $38 billion in aid from the United States. It doesn't seem like this is any real threat as stopping the bill from going through, but just that somebody, would take the time and make the stand to do this is important. I know Rand Paul typically comes from the more conservative platform on the issue, saying that, a nation in debt shouldn't be giving money away to other people. But, whatever gets aid to Israel cut, because a lot of that money is going to be used, to oppress the Palestinians and also to enrich the elites of that country. A story I talked about a while ago and haven't mentioned, although it's been developing in recent weeks. Sometime back, there was a UK, I believe like doctoral student who traveled to the Emirates to do some research on the country. The Emirates accused him of being a spy and imprisoned him and convicted him in what seemed to be a sham trial. Why the UK would, have a spy poking around the Emirates, that they failed to explain or why this guy is actually a spy. But just recently, and I think after some political pressure, the Emirates finally released this guy. So that was good to see. I think they really kind of forced this guy's wife into silence for a long time. And then she finally had enough of it and started to raise alarms once he was convicted and sentenced to a long, if not life sentence, in jail. And so he's out now, and I guess he's home to the UK. Afghanistan, we have 4 U.S. soldiers killed in the past week. One was killed in the Coast Province fighting against Al-Qaeda. At least that's the official story by the U.S. I don't have a lot of other details on that one yet. And more recently, in fact, just an hour or two before I'm recording this show, we have reports here that 3 U.S. soldiers were killed in a massive roadside bombing outside of Ghazni City, which is been a real battlefield of late between the Taliban and the Afghan government, with the Taliban making some pretty major gains, including taking the city of Ghazni at one point and taking several other districts around that province that were once seen as strongholds and secure districts by the government. I mean, all this is just representative of how much we need to get out of Afghanistan. It's nice to see, at least when I look at these articles now, the comment sections are just filled with 17 years. What are we still doing here? What are these guys going over there and fighting and dying for? It's disgusting. And, as I start to say in 2017, and I'll keep repeating on this show, that their blood is on Donald Trump's hands. He's electing to have these soldiers there unnecessarily, and every time one of them dies, it's because he hasn't made the right decision to bring him home. And as much as people like to praise him because his instincts are to say, we shouldn't be in Afghanistan, he let himself get bullied into it, and so, now it's all his fault, his responsibility. A couple of weeks ago, a Shia militant commander, so it doesn't sound like a official Afghan army militia, was arrested for war crimes by the government there. Protests broke out among the Shiite Hazara community in Kabul. They got a little bit violent with police, and this guy is released. Does seem to me to show that, the state there is probably not that strong if they can't hold war criminals in prison, and you have that big of outcries and outbursts from the population there. And, factions, the Hazaras are not the Pashtuns. They're not the Taliban. These are supposed to be the people in alliance with the government, and obviously, it doesn't seem like that ruling coalition is all that strong. Afghan soldiers are dying by the dozens. It seems, once, twice, even 3-4 times a week sometimes. You see reports 15, 20 Afghan soldiers killed by the Taliban in a bombing on a mosque, a raid on a base, just taking out different checkpoints. Some nights you read that, it was 25 different checkpoints the Taliban attacked and, killed not even a soldier at all of them, but in several cases they kill a soldier and it adds up to 15, 20, 30 people end up being killed. And so, the Taliban are just, seeming to be on a massive offensive right now against the Afghan government. We do have, and I don't think I've mentioned this on the show yet, the U.S. envoy to Afghanistan, Zalil Khalilzad, saying that he thinks that the U.S. could have a peace deal with the Taliban by April. So that would be, something massively worth celebrating, but it seems awfully optimistic unless the U.S. is willing to really leave Afghanistan, because that's a Taliban demand, and it seems the Taliban are winning at this point. I want to mention this story about Syria because I think it's going to probably have quite a few ripple effects in geopolitics. The United States announced they're going to train an additional 30,000 Kurdish fighters. I haven't seen the breakdown here to know how many of these 30,000 are being trained are replacing killed and injured fighters of, I believe, about the 60,000 man Kurdish fighting force the U.S. has kind of raised already in Syria. people who are just kind of phasing out their terms, they're getting out of the war. It may be that, they're only going to add like 5 to 10,000 to the ranks, or it could be that they're, planning on adding 30,000. They're already replacing all the other troops. This is an additional, bringing the fighting force up to 90,000. This will probably be concerning to Syria, Russia, Iran, and the Iraqi government, kind of on the side of, we don't want this to happen. Turkey will certainly be very upset about this, and that may be where the United States sees the biggest pushback. It wasn't long after the United States first announced the 30,000-man border force that they were going to train for the Kurds, that the Turks attacked and invaded Syria in the Afrin enclave that was held by the Kurds. The last thing I'm going to mention on today's show, and it's not something that I know a lot about what's going on, but I just wanted to point out, and that is, you have a lot of reports from AFRICOM saying that the U.S. is killing dozens, if not more, Al-Shabaab fighters at a time in airstrikes in Somalia. I like to report these in Immersion News and all my news roundups, but unfortunately, all you really have is the claims of the Pentagon here. And so I'll typically put that the Pentagon is making this claim. It could be that they're really wiping out Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Scott Horton had a guest on the show a while back. It was a really good interview, and it explained how Al-Shabaab has really been artificially empowered in Somalia and doesn't likely have, that much of a kind of a grassroots basis in the country. There's really not a lot of room for the jihadist types in Somalia. However, political situations on the ground and what the United States and Ethiopia did by destroying the Islamic Courts Union gave Al-Shabaab a massive amount of power in the country. And so it could be that, they're just losing a war that they really should have never been winning in the first place at this point. Or it could be that the United States is just killing a lot of civilians and they always call them militants. We had the Obama policy for a long time that any military-aged male, or anybody, I guess, who looked like a military-aged male that got killed, they always chalked up to being a militant. And so, your life's forfeit. All right. I think that's all I have for today. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, immersionnews.com is my news website. Minds.com/immersionnews is my account there. Minds.com is an awesome crypto social networking site, very decentralized. And I actually like the layout and stuff like that a lot more than Facebook. I get a lot less junk there. Check out my Patreon if you want to support the show. I know a lot of you have been doing that, and I really appreciate it. And that's patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, and Twitter is @KYAAALE.